The town of Black Hollow had been abandoned for decades, but no one knew why. There were no records of mass evacuations, no signs of war or plague. It was as if one day, everyone in the town had simply disappeared, leaving behind homes filled with uneaten meals, cars with their engines still running, and radios playing static. Some said it was haunted. Others believed something darker had taken hold of the land. No one dared to enter until now. Alex was a documentary filmmaker. He had spent years searching for the perfect subject, something real, something terrifying. When he stumbled upon Black Hollow, he knew this was it. It wasn't on any map, not even in historical records. It was as if the town had been erased from existence. But he found stories whispers on conspiracy forums, old newspaper clippings about strange lights and vanishing people. No one had ever come back to tell the truth. That was the challenge. He gathered his team: Mia, the historian, Dan, the cameraman, and James, the skeptic. They arrived just before dusk, their van crunching over the overgrown road that led into the forgotten town. The sign was still standing, rusted and nearly unreadable. Welcome to Black Hollow. Population: 0. The streets were eerily intact. Houses, streetlights, shops, everything looked as if it had been abandoned in an instant. The windows of the buildings stared back at them, dark and hollow. The town was frozen in time. They began filming immediately. Mia took notes on the architecture, pointing out the strange way the houses were built too symmetrical, as if someone had replicated them from a single blueprint. Dan adjusted his camera, capturing every eerie detail. James, ever the skeptic, laughed at their unease. Come on, guys. It's just an old town. People probably left because of an economic collapse or something. But there was no sign of struggle, no looting, no decay beyond the natural passage of time. It was as if the people had vanished into thin air. They moved deeper into the town. The school still had books open on desks. The diner had plates of food covered in dust. A single swing in the playground creaked in the wind. Then they found the church. At the edge of town, the only building with locked doors. It was massive, more like a cathedral than a small town chapel. Its spire stretched too high into the sky, casting an unnatural shadow over the graveyard beside it. "Let's get inside," Alex said. Mia hesitated. "Maybe we shouldn't." A ghost? Dan aimed his camera at the towering doors. "If this place is haunted, that's where we'll find proof." They pushed. The doors groaned, but did not open. Then, a sound, a deep, distant chime. From inside the church, Alex checked his watch. It was midnight. The bells were ringing, though no one was inside. Dan raised his camera, adjusting the lens. What the hell? Then, something moved. Behind the stained glass windows, a figure, tall, watching. James laughed nervously. "All right, that's creepy." The bells stopped. Silence. Then, the doors unlocked by themselves. A low creak as they slowly swung open, revealing the darkness inside. "That's an invitation," Mia whispered. Dan stepped forward first, camera rolling. Alex followed. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. The church was massive, larger than it had seemed from the outside. The pews were covered in a thin layer of dust, yet the candles on the altar were lit. A massive crucifix hung above, but the figure of Christ had been removed. In its place was something else. Something wrong. A shape carved from black stone, depicting a being with too many limbs. eyes that followed them as they moved. Dan's camera flickered. The screen filled with static. Then, the whispers began. Soft at first, then louder. Too many voices at once. Mia clutched her notebook. "Do you hear that?" James stepped back. "It's just wind." But there was no wind. The air was still. The whispers grew closer. A shuffling sound from the pews. Something was there. Dan swung the camera. The pews were full. Rows of figures, sitting in silence, dressed in black robes. Their faces hidden, not moving, not breathing. Then, they all turned at the same time and smiled. Dan screamed. The camera feed cut to black. They ran out of the church, into the night, but the town had changed. The streets were different. The buildings shifted, stretching, twisting. The sky wasn't the same sky. Alex grabbed Mia's arm. "We have to find the van." But the van was gone. The town had swallowed it. Then came the sound. A deep, inhuman wail. From every direction, a shape emerged from the church. Tall, its limbs too long, its face shifting. It spoke, though its mouth did not move. "You don't belong here." Then, darkness. Alex woke up in his apartment. His head pounded. His heart raced. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? He sat up, grabbing his phone. No calls. No messages. No proof. His camera equipment was gone. His notebook missing. His friends, he called them. No numbers found. His hands shook as he ran to his desk, flipping through his laptop, his research. The maps. Black Hollow did not exist. Not in history. Not on any database. Not on any map. His breath came in sharp gasps. Then he heard it. A faint chime. The sound of a bell. He turned toward his window. And outside, where his city should have been, he saw Black Hollow, waiting, calling him home. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Midnight Mass begins soon. Don't be late." The reflection in his window smiled. And this time, it wasn't his. Alex never spoke about Black Hollow again. After that night, he did everything he could to erase it from his mind. He threw away his old research, deleted every saved file, and burned the last pages of his notebook. He tried to tell himself it had never happened, that the town was just a fever dream, a product of exhaustion and paranoia, but deep down, he knew better. Because Black Hollow hadn't let him go. For weeks, the nightmares followed him. Visions of the twisting streets, the faceless figures, the black-robed congregation inside the church. He woke up drenched in sweat, his ears still ringing with the sound of the midnight bell. And the messages never stopped. His phone, his laptop, even his television screen, they all flickered with the same words. "Midnight Mass begins soon. Don't be late." The worst part? His friends were gone. Mia, Dan, James. Their numbers didn't exist. Their emails bounced back. Their social media profiles had been wiped clean. It was as if they had never been real. As if they had been erased. And Alex was next. One night, the messages changed. A single text from an unknown number. "Look outside." His blood turned to ice. He didn't want to. He knew what he would see. But his body moved on its own. Slowly, he turned toward the window. And there, at the end of his empty street, Black Hollow was waiting. The streetlights flickered. The sky above had shifted, no longer the familiar city skyline, but a dark, endless void. and standing beneath the closest street lamp was Mia. Her clothes were torn and stained with something dark. Her skin pale, almost gray. She lifted a hand and pointed at him. Then her mouth opened. Too wide. Too wrong. No sound came out, just a void. A black abyss where her voice should have been. Alex stumbled backward. His breath came in short gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His phone buzzed again. Another message. It's time to come home. The power in his apartment went out. A deep, suffocating darkness swallowed the room. And in that silence, the bell chimed. Midnight. Alex's hands shook as he reached for his keys. He needed to leave. Now, he grabbed his bag, his jacket, anything that would make him feel grounded. Then, the front door swung open by itself. Beyond it, his apartment hallway was gone. Instead, there was a road. The road to Black Hollow. The street signs twisted, shifting before his eyes. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The smell of damp earth and old stone filled the air. And at the end of the road, where his city should have been, the church stood, tall, waiting. The doors were open. The candles inside were already lit, and the congregation was waiting for him. Black-robed figures lined the pews, their faces hidden, their bodies still. The whispers started, low, humming, calling. Alex tried to run, but his body wouldn't move. The town had already taken hold of him. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying voices, familiar voices. Mia, Dan, James, begging, crying, calling his name. But when he looked, they weren't human anymore. Their bodies were stretched, their limbs too long, their faces a blur of shifting features. They weren't people. They were part of Black Hollow now, and soon, he would be too. The bells rang one last time. The robed figures turned to face him, their smiles stretched wide. And from the altar, a single voice spoke, a voice that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kneel. Alex felt his legs collapse beneath him. The whispers rose. The town pulsed around him. His vision blurred. Then, darkness. Alex woke up to the sound of traffic. Sunlight streamed through his window. His apartment was exactly as it had been. No messages, no robed figures, no Black Hollow. Just normal life. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? He rubbed his face, letting out a shaky breath. It was over. He was safe. Then his phone buzzed. A text. From an unknown number. Welcome home, Father Alex. His stomach dropped. He turned to the mirror, and his reflection was still kneeling, still trapped in the church, still staring at him, still smiling. Then the bells rang again, and Black Hollow took him for good. The train rumbled through the quiet town of Black Hollow, its whistle echoing through the cold autumn night. The station was nearly empty, save for a few late travelers huddled beneath the dim glow of rusted lamps. The air smelled of rain-soaked wood and iron, the scent of something old, something forgotten. Ava Langley pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the platform, her suitcase dragging against the cracked pavement. She had never been here before, never even heard of this place until she received the letter. It had arrived without a return address, written in delicate, almost trembling script. Miss Langley, you have inherited your great-aunt Eleanor's estate in Black Hollow. Please arrive by the 8:45 train. Do not miss it. She hadn't even known she had a great-aunt Eleanor. The train doors hissed shut behind her. The conductor, an older man with hollow eyes, tipped his hat in her direction before stepping back into the shadows. Ava turned to the station sign, its letters nearly worn away. Black Hollow, Est, 1886. A chill crept up her spine. Something about this place felt wrong. The town looked almost frozen in time. The old brick buildings lined with iron lanterns that flickered against the wind. The streets were empty. No cars, no people, just a hollow silence that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. A single black car sat waiting at the curb. Its engine was running, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the town. Ava hesitated before stepping closer, peering through the driver's window. The car was empty. The back door swung open on its own. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The logical part of her told her to run, to get back on that train. But the letter in her pocket burned against her skin. She had come this far. Slowly, she climbed inside. The door clicked shut behind her, and the car lurched forward, moving on its own. No driver, no sound but the tires rolling over the damp pavement. She pressed her fingers against the window, watching the town blur past. The buildings were too still, the windows dark, like a place abandoned, yet still breathing. She caught movement in the corner of her vision, a figure standing beneath a street lamp, watching as the car passed. It was a woman, dressed in black, her hair covering her face. Ava's pulse quickened. She turned in her seat to get another look. The woman was now standing right outside her window. Ava gasped, heart slamming against her ribs. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't run, had just appeared. And as the car sped through the night, Ava realized something else. The woman wasn't standing on the ground. Her feet were hovering inches above it. Ava squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But when she opened them again, the woman was inside the car, sitting right beside her. The air turned ice cold. The smell of damp earth filled the space. Ava turned her head slowly, barely breathing. The woman's face was inches from hers. Her skin was gray, her lips stitched shut, her eyes black, endless. Ava screamed. The car veered off the road, slamming into something unseen. The impact sent her tumbling into darkness. She woke to the sound of dripping water. The scent of mold and rot filled her lungs as she forced her eyes open. She wasn't in the car anymore. She was somewhere underground, the walls damp, covered in something dark that pulsed beneath her fingers. Her head ached, her body heavy. A faint light flickered from the end of a narrow corridor. Ava swallowed hard and pushed herself up, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't remember getting here. She didn't remember anything after the crash. But she wasn't alone. Something was breathing in the dark, slow, ragged, close. Ava forced herself forward, step by step, her breath catching in her throat. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling pressing lower. The walls seemed to move, shifting like something alive. Then she saw them, faces, pressed into the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes followed her, their expressions frozen in horror. She staggered back, her pulse roaring in her ears. A hand burst from the wall, fingers clawing at her wrist. Ava shrieked, wrenching herself free. The hand twitched violently before sinking back into the stone like it had never been there. She ran. The air grew heavier as she stumbled down the corridor, the whispers swelling around her, voices overlapping, begging, pleading. Don't let her take you. She is watching. Run. Her lungs burned. She reached the end of the corridor, slamming into a wooden door. She clawed at the handle, throwing her weight against it. and then it opened. Ava fell forward into a room full of mirrors, hundreds of them lining the walls, the ceiling, the floor. But they weren't reflecting her. They were showing something else. The same woman from the road. Her black eyes locked onto Ava's through the glass. Her lips began to pull apart, the stitches unraveling, her mouth stretching into something unnatural. Ava turned to run, but the door was gone. And in the mirrors, the woman was stepping closer. The glass began to crack. Ava's own reflection was reaching for her, its hands twisting, clawing at the surface, trying to pull her in. Then, a whisper right against her ear. "It's your turn." The glass shattered, and everything went black. The next morning, the 8:45 train arrived at the Black Hollow station. A woman stepped off. She looked like Ava Langley. She had the same eyes, the same face. But when she smiled, her lips were stitched shut. The streets of Black Hollow were never truly empty, even when they appeared to be. The buildings stood too still, their windows dark, as if they were watching. The wind whispered through the alleyways, carrying voices that no one should have been able to hear. The 8:45 train had come and gone, but something had stayed behind. The woman who stepped off the platform looked like Ava Langley. Same eyes, same face. But she wasn't Ava anymore. She walked through the town as if she belonged there, though the people she passed barely acknowledged her. Their movements were mechanical, their eyes dull. It was as if they had all been replaced by something else. She arrived at Eleanor Langley's estate, an old Victorian mansion at the edge of town. The iron gate swung open on its own. The house loomed before her, its windows dark, the wooden beams groaning against the weight of time. She had never seen it before, yet somewhere deep inside, she knew it. She stepped inside. The door locked behind her. The house wasn't abandoned. It breathed. The wallpaper was damp, peeling in long, curling strips. The chandelier above her swayed, though there was no wind. A low hum filled the air, like the distant murmur of voices behind a thick door. Avor, what was left of her, walked down the hallway, trailing her fingers along the walls. The wood pulsed beneath her touch. It remembered her. She stopped in front of a mirror at the end of the hall, and then the glass rippled. Ava's reflection smiled. Her lips were stitched shut, the stitches twisted, pulling apart. Black liquid oozed from the threads, running down her chin like ink. Her reflection tilted its head. "You never left." Ava turned away from the mirror. Something moved behind her. She wasn't alone. The whispering started again, not just in the house. The entire town whispered. She could hear it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the breath between heartbeats. She moved toward the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick, rotting carpet. As she ascended, the whispers grew louder. The house shifted around her, closing in like it was swallowing her whole. She reached the top of the stairs, and then she saw the door. It was different from the others. It wasn't wooden, it was made of glass. Behind it, something shifted, a shadow moving just beyond the surface. The whispers swelled. Ava placed a trembling hand against the glass. It was cold. The shadow on the other side stopped moving. Then, a hand slammed against the glass from the other side. Ava staggered back. The glass began to crack, and a voice her own voice whispered from within, "Let me out." The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. And it remembered her. Ava ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway stretched longer than before, the doors shifting, the walls bending. She could hear footsteps behind her, too many coming closer. She reached for the front door, but it wasn't there anymore, only another mirror. She turned, chest rising and falling with frantic breath. And then The figure stepped out of the shadows. It had her face. It had her eyes. But it wasn't her. It moved toward her, tilting its head, its smile growing impossibly wide. "It's your turn," Ava screamed. The mirror shattered, and everything went dark. The next morning, the 8:45 train arrived at Black Hollow. A woman stepped off the platform. She looked like Ava Langley, but she wasn't Ava anymore. The rain fell in slow, heavy sheets, soaking the cracked pavement of the long-forgotten highway. Miles from civilization, the only sound was the rhythmic patter of water against the roof of a single car, its headlights flickering against the dense fog that rolled across the road like a living thing. Olivia Evans gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles pale. Her GPS had stopped working an hour ago. The radio had given nothing but static, and her phone screen displayed no service in stark white letters. She wasn't supposed to be on this road. The freeway had been closed off due to flooding, forcing her onto an old back road that shouldn't have taken this long to navigate. The trees on either side were too tall, their branches stretching over the road like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little moonlight struggled through the thick clouds. The rain grew heavier. Up ahead, a sign appeared in her headlights. "Welcome to Marrowwood. Population 241. Olivia's stomach twisted. She had never heard of this place. It wasn't on any map she had seen. The paint on the sign was faded, the numbers scratched into the wood as if someone had tried to change them but failed. A flickering neon light glowed in the distance. A gas station. Relief flooded her chest as she pulled into the lot. The old pumps rusted and covered in ivy. The sign above the convenience store buzzed weakly, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. Inside, the store was empty. No cashier, no customers. Just rows of outdated snacks and dusty shelves, as if no one had been inside for years. Then, a voice. "You shouldn't be here." Olivia spun around. A man stood behind the counter, his skin pale, his eyes sunken. He wasn't looking at her, not exactly. His gaze was just past her, as if he was seeing something standing behind her. Her breath hitched. I just need directions," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I got lost. My GPS isn't working." The man swallowed hard. He still wasn't looking at her. "Leave." A flicker of movement in the convex mirror near the ceiling made Olivia's pulse spike. A figure, tall, unmoving. She spun, but no one was there. Her heart pounded in her ears. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting shadows that didn't make sense. Then she noticed it. The newspaper rack near the counter. The top paper was old, yellowed with time, but the headline stood out like a wound against the page. Marrowwood mass disappearances continue. Authorities baffled. Below the headline, a black and white photo of the very gas station she was standing in. Something cold curled around her spine. She turned back to the man behind the counter. His eyes were wide now, his expression frozen in fear. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but then the lights died. Total darkness swallowed the store. The silence was suffocating. Then, from the aisles, the sound of breathing. Not hers. Something else. The whisper came right against her ear. "You were never supposed to come here." A hand grabbed her wrist. She screamed. Then nothing. Olivia woke up in her car. The engine was running. The rain had stopped. For a moment, she sat there, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Then she saw it. The gas station. It was gone. Nothing remained but an empty lot, cracked pavement overtaken by weeds, as if the station had never existed at all. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The sign stood ahead. Welcome to Marrowwood. The number had changed. Population 242. Her stomach dropped. She slammed her foot onto the gas pedal, speeding down the highway. The trees blurred past, the road stretching on endlessly. She checked the time on the dashboard. 1:13 a.m. She glanced at her phone. 1:13 a.m. Her pulse stilled. That was impossible. She had been driving for at least an hour. The time hadn't moved. A streetlight appeared up ahead. Number. Not a streetlight. The same neon sign. The gas station. She had driven in a circle. The newspaper was still on the ground outside. The headline the same, as if nothing had changed. She grabbed it with trembling fingers, searching for a date. There wasn't one, just one final line of text, printed at the very bottom of the page. No one leaves Marrowwood. The wind shifted, and behind her, the whisper came again. It's your turn now. Olivia turned. The man from the gas station stood beside her car. His eyes were black voids. His mouth stretched too wide. The world tilted. The air around her rippled like water. Then, everything went dark. The next morning, a new traveler drove into Marrowwood. A man, lost, confused, his GPS failing. He saw the sign at the edge of town. Welcome to Marrowwood. Population 243. Olivia woke up gasping for air. The moment she opened her eyes, she knew something was wrong. She wasn't in her car anymore. The sky above her was gray, swirling in unnatural patterns, as if the clouds were alive. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth and something rotting. She sat up, her hands sinking into soft soil, and when she looked around, her heart stopped. She was in Marrowwood. The gas station stood just as she had left it, its neon sign buzzing weakly. The lot was still empty, the old cracked pavement stretching in all directions. But now, there was something different. The town wasn't abandoned anymore. Figures stood in the distance, unmoving, watching. Their faces were blank. Their eyes were black, endless voids. They stood in front of the buildings, in the middle of the street, peering from behind windows. All of them were staring at her. Frantic gasps. She needed to leave. She turned back to her car, but it wasn't there. Just an empty space, like it had never existed. A whisper carried through the air. You're one of us now. Her stomach twisted. She took a step backward, and as soon as she did, the figures moved. Not walking, not running, just appearing closer. Their mouths opened too wide, stretching into dark, jagged holes. Their fingers elongated, reaching toward her. Their bodies unnaturally still, as if they weren't human at all. Olivia ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the street, past the sidings, past the rows of empty houses with their broken windows. The streets twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the town instead of out. No matter which way she ran, the road looped back around. Then the bell rang, a deep, echoing chime that shook the ground. She turned a corner and froze. A church stood at the edge of town, its wooden doors wide open. Inside, the dim glow of candlelight flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. The figures that had been chasing her stopped, as if waiting. She hesitated. Something in her bones told her not to go inside, but the road behind her was gone. There was nowhere else to go. She stepped forward, her body trembling. The air grew colder the moment she passed through the doors. The inside of the church was ancient, the wooden pews covered in dust, the walls lined with faded, cracked paintings of figures without faces. The altar stood at the far end, a massive book resting upon it. Her name was written on the open page. The ink was still wet. Her chest tightened. The candles flickered. A whisper slithered through the silence. "You belong to Marrowwood now." She turned. The woman from the gas station stood behind her. Her hair was long, black, moving as if caught in an invisible wind. Her eyes were bottomless voids, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. Her voice was barely a breath. "It's time." The room shifted. The floor beneath Olivia cracked, splitting apart as shadows poured out. Hands reached for her, clawing at her legs, her arms, dragging her down. She screamed. Everything went black. She woke up in her car. The engine was running. The rain had stopped. For a long moment, she sat there, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Her hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. Then, her heart stopped, because she recognized the street ahead, the same buildings, the same old houses, the gas station. She had driven in a circle. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She turned slowly toward the welcome sign. The number had changed. Population 244. Terror curled in her chest. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. No service. The time on the dashboard read 1:13 a.m., the same time as before. She gritted her teeth and floored the gas pedal. The road stretched before her, disappearing into the fog. She drove faster, her breath uneven, her fingers clenched around the wheel. The gas station blurred past. The road sign flickered by. And then, the same neon lights appeared again. The gas station was still there. She slammed the brakes, her stomach twisting as she stared at the station. A man stood outside, tall, unmoving. He was wearing her clothes. Her face, his eyes were black voids. A chill slithered down her spine. Then, he smiled. The whisper returned, curling around her ears like smoke. "Welcome home, Olivia." The radio turned on by itself. Static crackled through the speakers. And then, a voice. "You never left." Her breath caught. The figure took a step forward. She couldn't move. Her hands gripped the wheel, her heart hammering too fast, but her body wouldn't listen. He reached the hood of the car. His head tilted. The lights flickered. Then, everything went dark. The next morning, a new traveler drove into Marrowwood. A woman, lost, her GPS failing. She saw the sign at the edge of town. "Welcome to Marrowwood. Population 245."